Welcome back to another evening of stories, mischief, and the occasional perilous adventure. Tonight we're following a weary little dungeon party. Heroes who've seen better days adventuring no longer pays the bills, and every other week some new, chosen one is cropping up to slay dragons or face off against necromancers, leaving our trio to mop up the scraps. With Halloween on the horizon, however, a peculiar opportunity arises, a chance for our adventurers to turn the tables on the mundane, to craft something memorable and terrifying. Nicholas Highforge, Justicar of no small reputation, dropped his warhammer with a hollow clang that echoed through the stone corridor. He slumped against the wall, rubbing at his wrists. Purple bruises already began to bloom beneath his gauntlets. "I should have become a bard," he muttered, tilting his head until it thumped against the rough stone. By the light, it would have been so much simpler singing songs, charming wenches traveling from tavern to tavern instead of wrestling overgrown rats and delusional goblins. Across from him, Jerica, the crimson-skinned tiefling rogue, crouched gracefully, wiping goblin blood from her twin daggers. Her horns curved back like polished obsidian, and the dark swirling patterns along her arms made her appear as if inked by living tattoos. Lockpicks dangled from a chain around her neck like sinister jewelry, and her belt was festooned with pouches whose contents no one dared guess. Her spaded tail flicked impatiently, narrowly missing a suspicious puddle of something. "I mean, really," she said dryly, "they were worshipping a pumpkin. A very large pumpkin." Bink Burnside, the gnome wizard, perched atop an overturned crate, sniffed the air with exaggerated delight. His nasally voice carried more cheer than either of his companions could muster. "Ah, I can see why they admired it," he said, rifling through his component pouch. He whispered an incantation, and 2 butter cookies appeared in the air, still warm, smelling of vanilla and cinnamon. They landed gently in his hands. He broke them in pieces and offered them around. Jerica caught hers with a flick of her tail, popping one piece into her mouth while scrutinizing the other. "You know, for someone who can literally create food from nothing, you'd think you'd be less stingy with portions." "The laws of arcane thermodynamics are not stingy," Bink replied, adjusting his spectacles with a stained finger. "If I could conjure a feast from a cantrip, don't." "You think I would? I've spent countless nights optimizing the mana-to-calorie conversion rate. And these cookies? Revolutionary." Nicholas accepted a piece reluctantly. Tasting it, he couldn't help but nod in quiet approval. Bink's pastries were always impressive, even if a bit magically odd. The dungeon itself was chaos incarnate. Broken goblin weapons littered the floor like fallen leaves. Crude totems, fashioned from stolen farm tools, leaned drunkenly against the walls. A fire smoldered somewhere deeper, filling the air with the acrid stench of something burned beyond recognition. Nicholas didn't want to know. At the far end of the corridor, atop a makeshift altar of crates and tattered blankets, sat the prize pumpkin. A crown fashioned from bent spoons rested atop it, surrounded by offerings of shiny rocks and missing left boots, clearly a goblin shrine. "Okay, then," Nicholas said, brushing cookie crumbs from his tabard. "Let's get His Majesty back to the village before the goblins' cousins show up seeking revenge." "Do goblins have cousins?" Bink asked, hopping down with surprising grace. "Everything has cousins," Jerica said flatly, sheathing her daggers. "Trust me." It took them nearly an hour to maneuver the massive pumpkin onto an abandoned wheelbarrow, another hour to trudge through the forest of Arishai, leaves crunching underfoot, the autumn sun filtering through gold and crimson canopy, painting the path with long, slanting rays. By the time they reached Millhaven, a modest village of 40 buildings clustered around a central square, Nicholas' arms felt like overcooked noodles, and his back screamed in protest. A small crowd had gathered in the square. Old Mossback, the weathered farmer, rushed forward, tears streaming down his cheeks. "My pumpkin, my beautiful girl?" he cried, clutching the gourd as if it were a long-lost child. The village bailiff, Hendrik Bramble, a portly man who always looked like he'd eaten something sour, approached with a small leather purse. 5 gold coins, 8 silver, and a handful of copper clinked into Nicholas' gauntlet. The adventurers stared. Bink's pointed ears flushed pink. "That's it?" "That's it," Hendrik said firmly. "Job done. Goblins cleared, pumpkin returned. Go spend it wisely." Bink slammed his fist on the table, the blue flame dancing around his finger, snapping to life. "I've got an idea. What if we let the village experience what we go through without the danger, of course?" Jericho raised an eyebrow. "All that arcane dabbling's gotten to you, hasn't it?" Nicholas leaned forward, intrigued despite exhaustion. "Go on." Bink bounced in his seat like an excited child. "We turn the dungeon into a haunted house. We scare them, thrill them, give them adventure without risking life or limb. Charge a couple of gold coins per person. 2 weeks plenty of time." The next morning dawned crisp, the air tinged with frost that melted as sunlight climbed higher. Nicholas found himself outside Millhaven's narrow print shop, peering through the window. Inside, Jericho leaned across the counter, speaking in low tones to the proprietor, Aldous Finch, a nervous man whose hands trembled as he set type for the posters. Whatever she'd whispered had him pale and nodding frantically. "I don't want to know," Nicholas muttered. "Then don't ask," she replied cheerfully, leaving him with no answers. True to her word, or perhaps to Aldous' fear, the posters were ready by noon, still smelling of fresh ink. Bink had outdone himself with the design. Bold letters proclaimed the haunted house of Arishai, promising a night of scares and adventure. "If you dare." Below, in smaller print, "All Hallows Eve, dusk till midnight. 2 gold coins per person. Not recommended for the faint of heart." Nicholas read aloud, squinting. "That's a bit dramatic, isn't it?" "Perfect," Bink said, hands waving as if conducting invisible music. "Consistent, mysterious, enticing. People will be curious." By afternoon, the posters adorned every conceivable surface in Millhaven. Jericho had delivered them to guild halls, the farmers' collective, and even the small temple of the dawn. Bink, ever personable despite his size, visited shops and convinced Gertrude to hang one prominently behind the bar at the Cracked Flagon. They even sent a stack with a traveling merchant to the next town over, paying him from the leftover gold from their pumpkin adventure. "Not bad," Nicholas said, surveying the results. The posters fluttered in the breeze, drawing curious glances from villagers. "Now," Bink said, adjusting his pointed hat, "comes the fun part." The dungeon waited, its entrance gaping like a dark mouth carved into the hillside. Ivy and moss half hidden the opening, giving it a naturally sinister air. Sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, leaving the corridor in perpetual twilight, perfect for what they had in mind. Bink unfurled a parchment covered in sketches. Basic floor plan. We'll need a clear path for visitors. Don't want anyone wandering off. Nicholas dropped his pack filled with rope, nails, tar, and miscellaneous supplies Bink insisted upon. Groups of 4 to 6, Bink said decisively. Small enough to feel isolated, big enough to pay the rent. Timing and spacing are everything. Jericho raised an eyebrow. How do you know so much about this? Bink fixed her with an intense stare. A wizard never reveals all his secrets. They began cleaning. Goblin bodies had been removed by the village guard, but broken pottery, moldy food scraps, and suspicious stains remained. Bink muttered spells under his breath, magically sanitizing the dungeon in carefully orchestrated patterns. Nicholas wiped his brow. This is officially the least heroic thing I've ever done, he muttered. I once spent 3 days in a sewer tracking a murloc, Jericho said, dragging a sack of garbage. This is pleasant by comparison. Nicholas mused. You've lived a very strange life. And you talk to your god before breakfast, Jericho teased back. Once the corridors were clear, Bink began his magical renovations. He murmured incantations, tracing intricate patterns with his fingers. Torches once ordinary now flickered with green and purple flames, throwing grotesque shadows along the walls. The effect transformed the space from mundane caves to the hideout of a vampire lord. Jericho set her traps with precision tripwires, ceiling nets, false floors that dropped visitors onto strategically placed cushions. You sure these won't hurt anyone? Nicholas asked yet again. Come on, Nicholas. I've been avoiding traps since I was 7. I know exactly how scary is fun. She threw a rope at his head for emphasis. Nicholas turned to his own role. Using his holy magic, he created glowing sigils on the walls, symbols of light, twisted into something dark and ominous, giving the impression of a forbidden temple. He arranged old suits of goblin-looted armor in alcoves, sometimes propped with sticks to look as if standing guard. They look a bit too stationary, Bink observed, tapping his chin. He muttered a spell, hands glowing with blue and purple arcane energy. Each suit of armor stirred slightly, the helmets tracking movement, the gauntlets flexing, breastplates rising and falling as though breathing. That's horrifying, Nicholas said, genuine appreciation in his tone. Anyone who gets close triggers the movement, Bink explained. The exact distance varies. Odor might even play a part. Nicholas waved him off. Spare me the details. Next, Bink animated the goblin weapons. Swords, axes, and spears floated in midair, spinning and rattling. Jeremiah watched, arms crossed, a small smirk playing on her lips. You're having far too much fun with this. I'm a wizard, Bink said, spinning a particularly nasty-looking cleaver. Fun is part of the job description. As the afternoon wore on, the dungeon became unrecognizable. Green and purple torches cast writhing shadows. Floating weapons rotated menacingly. Glowing sigils pulsed. Suits of armor silently shifted. Tripwires, nets, and false floors awaited the unwary. Jericho had marked her own hiding spots with tiny chalk X's. Only she would notice ledges, curtain-draped alcoves, false walls. From these vantage points, she could leap out or whisper menacing words in passing visitors' ears. "What will you say?" Nicholas asked, watching her test a crevice behind a false wall. "Not decided yet," she replied, dropping her voice an octave. "Maybe you shouldn't have come here. Or they're still watching. Or just breathe heavily behind them. People hate that." Big added illusions triggered by proximity. A spectral woman in tattered robes would scream silently at the end of a corridor, vanishing moments later. And in the goblin shrine, Bink conjured a massive glowing eye above the altar, opening and scanning the room with a grinding stone sound, the centerpiece of their haunted experience. "Grand finale," Bink said, stepping back, hands on hips. "Before the exit, pure terror." The next day dawned bright and clear, a crisp wind rustling the orange and red leaves that littered Millhaven's cobblestone streets. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bink set out to plaster the village with their carefully designed posters. The three of them moved with purpose, each adopting a different role. Nicholas carried a ladder and sticky tarred rope to fasten posters high on walls. He grumbled under his breath about the indignity of using his paladin strength for manual labor rather than combat. "I swear, if I ever have to do this again," he muttered, lips pressed into a grim line. Jerica moved with grace, slipping into shops, guild halls, and even the small Temple of the Dawn. She delivered posters with practiced charm and a subtle dose of mischief. A shopkeeper who refused to take one at first found a dagger carefully placed on the counter, just close enough to make him rethink his stance. She winked and moved on, leaving him pale and compliant. Bink, meanwhile, waddled from store to store, carrying a bundle of posters under his arm. He charmed merchants, convinced tavern owners, and even persuaded Gertrude at the Cracked Flagon to display one behind the bar. He spoke with the enthusiasm of a child selling sweets, hands flailing, eyes twinkling. A night of adventure. Terrifying thrills await. Only 2 gold coins. Don't miss it. Nicholas surveyed their handiwork from the town square, hands on his hips. Posters fluttered in the breeze, drawing curious glances from passing villagers. "Not bad," he said. "By nightfall, this town will know about our haunted house." Bink clapped his hands together. Now comes the fun part, preparation. The trio returned to the dungeon with carts loaded with supplies nails, rope, black cloth, old goblin armor, and Bink's assortment of magical trinkets. The mood had shifted. No longer were they adventurers seeking glory, they were theatrical producers, set designers, and mischievous architects of terror. Jerica surveyed the entrance. "Control the flow of people," she said. "Bottleneck here, natural choke points along the corridor. We don't want chaos. Safety first, scares second." Bink spread out his parchment floor plan. 4 to 6 per group. Small enough to feel isolated, large enough to pay the rent. Timing is everything. Nicholas dropped his pack. "And how exactly do we keep them moving? They're not used to dungeons." "Fright and illusion," Bink replied, already muttering under his breath and sketching on the floor with glowing runes. "The unknown keeps them moving. The anticipation of something lurking around each corner." The first task was lighting. Bink moved from torch bracket to torch bracket, murmuring incantations, tracing patterns in the air with his fingers. Ordinary orange flames now flickered in sickly greens and purples, casting eerie, writhing shadows. The dungeon felt like a vampire's lair. Nicholas admired the effect, despite his exhaustion. Jerica began her trap placements with precision. Tripwires across corridors, nets rigged in the ceilings, false floor panels carefully cushioned to drop visitors a few feet. Nicholas had asked repeatedly if these would be safe. Each time she reassured him, a sly smile tugging at her lips. Nicholas took up his own task, creating glowing sigils on the walls, twisting holy symbols into foreboding shapes. He positioned old suits of armor in alcoves, propped with rope to appear as if standing guard. "They move slightly," Banks said, hands glowing. Helmets track movement, gauntlets flex, breastplates rise and fall, triggered by proximity. "That's horrifying," Nicholas said, genuinely impressed. "And fun," Bank added, sending goblin weapons floating, spinning, rattling. "If I'm not having fun, I'm doing it wrong." By mid-afternoon, the dungeon had transformed completely. Glowing torches threw writhing shadows. Floating weapons spun slowly. Sigils pulsed ominously. Armor silently rotated. Tripwires, nets, and false floors awaited the unsuspecting. Jerica had staked her hiding spots, ledges, curtain-draped alcoves, false walls. She could leap from the shadows, whisper unnerving words, or make a subtle movement to frighten guests. Nicholas observed her testing one of the false walls, his hair bristling at the low, ominous whispers she practiced. "Not decided yet," she said. "Maybe you shouldn't have come here. Or they're still watching. Or just breathe heavily behind them. People hate that." Bank created illusions that would trigger as visitors passed. A spectral woman in tattered robes appeared in a corridor, screamed silently, and vanished. And in the goblin shrine, a massive glowing eye opened above the altar, scanning the room and producing a grinding stone noise, the grand finale. "Perfect," Banks said, stepping back. "This is our crescendo." They exit after that, hearts racing. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bank spent the rest of the day running through the dungeon themselves, testing triggers, tripwires, illusions, and timing. Laughter and occasional yelps filled the air as Bank accidentally set off one of his own illusions. Nicholas tripped on a rope, landing in a cushioned trap floor. Jerica swore under her breath, only to laugh a moment later at his groan. By evening, exhaustion had taken hold. Dirt smudged their faces. Hands were scraped from moving props. Magical energy crackled faintly in Bink's fingertips. But as they stood at the dungeon entrance, surveying their handiwork, a shared grin passed between them. They had created something incredible, a haunted experience that blended magic, skill, and imagination. "Tomorrow," Nicholas said, his voice hoarse but determined, "we find out if the village is ready for us." Night fell over Millhaven with a crisp chill in the air, the scent of wood smoke and cider mingling as villagers began to gather near the torch-lit path leading to the dungeon. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bank stood at the entrance, a mixture of anticipation and nerves twisting in their stomachs. "Are we ready for this?" Nicholas muttered, adjusting the straps on his ceremonial armor. The metal clinked softly in the twilight, sending reflections of torchlight dancing across the stone walls behind him. Jerica flicked her tail, a mischievous grin on her face. "We're ready. Or terrified enough that we're pretending we're ready. Same difference." Bink bounced on his toes, eyes glowing with excitement. Tonight, the villagers live like adventurers. They'll feel the thrill, the fear, the glory, all for 2 gold coins. Groups of 4 to 6 villagers arrived first, guided by torches and the fluttering posters. Nicholas checked the ropes and barriers one last time, ensuring safety while preserving the element of fright. Jerica crouched in the shadows, daggers at her side, poised to leap at unsuspecting passers-by. Bink hovered near a glowing sigil, muttering minor charms to enhance illusions. The first group stepped in, the air immediately thick with anticipation. The torches flickered green and purple, shadows writhed across the walls, and the distant sound of rattling armor echoed through the corridors. A young man stumbled slightly, eyes wide. Is this real?" he whispered. "Completely real," Nicholas muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Jerica to hear. She smirked, leaping from a hidden alcove and letting out a sharp whisper behind a villager. "You shouldn't have come here." The group jumped, a mixture of yelps and nervous laughter spilling out. Bink flicked his wrist, sending floating goblin weapons spinning in midair. The clanging made several villagers scream and jump back, while a few braver souls laughed nervously, fascinated rather than frightened. Through the night, the dungeon came alive. Spectral figures appeared and vanished. Glowing sigils pulsed ominously, drawing attention to corners where Jerica lurked. Animated armor followed visitors silently, heads turning in eerie synchronization. Tripwires and cushioned drop floors startled but caused no harm. Nicholas patrolled the corridors, casting subtle light spells to highlight the most intimidating features of the dungeon. "I've created something like a protective haunting," he muttered, adjusting his stance as he made himself a towering shadow. Villagers stumbled past, catching glimpses of his looming form. One bold child approached him, wide-eyed. "Are you a real paladin?" Nicholas crouched slightly, voice low and resonant. "I protect the light and the shadows." The child shrieked and ran back to their parents, who were laughing nervously, the thrill clear on their faces. Bink's illusions became progressively more elaborate. In the goblin shrine, the glowing eye opened and scanned the visitors as they approached. A grinding stone noise echoed, and soft whispers seemed to fill the air. Villagers shrank back, clutching each other's arms. One man, a blacksmith who had complained about everything in town, muttered through trembling lips, "I've never been more terrified or entertained." Jerica's traps worked beautifully. Nets dropped, ropes twitched, and hidden compartments released harmless bursts of confetti or colored smoke. She emerged from the shadows occasionally to whisper threats or breathe heavily behind the more confident adventurers. Screams, laughter, and gasps echoed through the dungeon, a symphony of controlled chaos. Outside, the village square buzzed with excitement. Children ran around with pumpkins and lanterns, parents sipped mulled cider, and old Mussback proudly recounted the story of his pumpkin's rescue. Bink, Nicholas, and Jerica peeked out intermittently to ensure the villagers were safe and enjoying themselves. Nicholas leaned against a wall, sweat dripping under his armor. "I can't believe this is working," he muttered. "We risked nothing, really, and yet they're thrilled." Jerica smirked, tail flicking. "That's the trick, Nicholas. Fear in small doses is fun. Danger without consequence. People pay for the experience." Bink waved his hands, sending ghostly figures floating across the corridors. Exactly. And we're doing it with style, precision, and a touch of arcane genius. As the night deepened, a moment of chaos nearly erupted. A group of villagers panicked at a combination of animated armor and a particularly loud illusion, running toward the exit in a tangle of limbs. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bink quickly intervened, Nicholas blocking the exit with his hulking form, Jerica guiding the frightened villagers calmly, and Bink suppressing the illusions with a flick of his wrist. Controlled chaos, Nicholas muttered, wiping his brow. Yes, that's what this is. Controlled chaos. By midnight, the final group exited the dungeon. Faces flushed, hearts pounding, laughter ringing in the corridors. The adventurers tallied the gold coins collected. Nicholas, counting carefully, allowed himself a small grin. Enough to cover rent, and then some. Jerica rolled her eyes but smiled, slinging her daggers over her shoulder. Not bad for a night's work, eh? Bink clapped, eyes sparkling. We've created an experience they'll talk about for years. Millhaven has never seen anything like this. Nicholas looked at his companions, their exhaustion clear, but the spark of pride in their eyes unmistakable. For the first time in months he felt it, the thrill of adventure not in combat, but in creation, in magic, in fear and fun, controlled in perfect measure. Nicholas woke with a crisp chill of early autumn brushing against his face. The fog still clung to the woods outside, draping the trees in a pale, ghostly veil. Dew clung to the leaves like tiny gems, each trembling in the faint morning breeze, producing soft, almost musical rustling. He stretched, feeling the stiffness of muscles unused to anything other than hauling armor and climbing stairways, and listened to the forest wake. Birds called tentatively, insects buzzed softly, and somewhere distant, a stream whispered over stones. Beside him, Jerica sat on the edge of her bed. Her horns, polished with a silvery sheen, caught the weak sunlight peeking through the window. She sat cross-legged, one hand idly tracing patterns on the floor, as though planning not just today but the entire season of events to come. She glanced at Nicholas, and her eyes, sharp and calculating, held a hint of mischief. "You've been thinking about the corridor again, haven't you?" she asked, quietly, not looking up. Nicholas could only nod, realizing she always knew when his thoughts were entangled with the dungeon layout, the illusions, and the scares. Bink, predictably, was still in bed, his room littered with glowing scrolls, half-finished enchantments, and small tools that occasionally sparked or hissed on their own. He muttered to himself in the kind of language only the magically inclined could understand, and every now and then one of his experiments would levitate slightly before wobbling to the floor. Even in sleep, Bink's mind churned with illusions and sound effects, fog machines, and enchantments that would make the villagers of Millhaven scream with delight or terror. Corday preparations. By mid-morning, they were at the dungeon entrance. The forest path leading to the stone steps was littered with fallen leaves, which crunched underfoot with every careful step. The smell of wet earth and moss filled the air, a sharp, grounding contrast to the magical anticipation buzzing between them. Nicholas adjusted his ceremonial armor, polished to a mirror sheen. Even the slightest misalignment of a strap or gauntlet plate could ruin the illusion of an unmoving statue, something he could not afford tonight. "This corridor," he said, running his gloved hand along the cold stone wall, "needs to feel alive. Every shadow must move, every sound must be just enough to make them question reality." His voice was muffled by the great helm, making him sound like some heavy metal sentinel from a forgotten legend. Jerica tilted her head, scanning the layout. Creepy. Very creepy. The height helps 7 feet of armored menace. They won't know what hit them. Bink consulted his notes, scribbled in frantic, looping handwriting. "We need sound effects in the walls, groans, scratching, chains rattling. I can enchant stones to produce the sounds when people pass, and we need fog at the entrance, something to disorient them from the start." He paused, eyes glinting with excitement. "It has to feel like they've stepped into a living nightmare." Jeremiah, the meticulous trap and illusion specialist, nodded in agreement. "I'll finish the false floor in the second chamber. Maybe a few surprises in the shrine room, falling totems, flickering lights. It has to be unpredictable, so every group reacts differently." Nicholas adjusted his hammer, the metal cool in his hands. "And I'll time my statue reveal carefully. Too soon and it loses impact. Too late and they might just walk past me. Precision is key." Working through the day, from dawn to dusk, the 3 of them labored. Ropes were strung, nets rigged, and enchanted stones embedded in the walls. Nicholas climbed ladders, tested the weight of nets, and polished his armor repeatedly until it gleamed in every torchlight. Jerica adjusted her costume, adding tattered strips of black cloth that would flutter when she moved and painting intricate patterns on her face, turning her already striking features into something hauntingly demonic. Bink moved between rooms, cackling softly as he tested illusions, creating glowing eyes, floating weapons, and sparks that would jump from his staff at the perfect moment. By nightfall, the dungeon was transformed. The green flicker of enchanted torches painted walls in eerie hues. Fog rolled from hidden corners, and every chamber seemed alive with potential horrors. They stepped back and admired their work. Every trap, illusion, and effect was in place. Every sound, light, and shadow calibrated to elicit maximum fear and excitement. Costumes and character roles. Nicholas's ceremonial armor, enhanced with vines and streaks of red paint, gave him the appearance of a cursed knight, eternally bound to guard the dungeon's depths. Jerica's leather and tattered cloth, horns glinting, and fanged grin made her look like a demon risen from the underworld. Bink, the mad cultist, had his robes enchanted to ripple unnaturally, his eyes able to glow a haunting white at key moments. He carried illusions of fire and smoke, ready to terrify anyone daring enough to enter. "All Hallows' Eve will never be the same," Jerica said, her voice gleaming with excitement as she tested the flicker of torchlight against her painted face. Nicholas allowed himself a rare smile. "We'll see if Millhaven survives us." The haunted house opens. As dusk fell, villagers began to gather. The cold wind rustled leaves along the forest path, carrying the scent of wet earth and autumn wood smoke. Lanterns bobbed along the path, tiny lights weaving through the fog. Nicholas stationed himself in his alcove, the green torchlight casting his armor in ghostly hues. The first group of villagers approached nervously, murmuring among themselves. Bink's amplified voice echoed through the entrance. "Welcome, welcome. Thank you for coming to the haunted house of Arashai. Remember the rules, stay together, follow the marked path, and beware the dungeon is alive." His whisper dropped to a chilling tone. "Once you enter, there's only one way out, through." The first group, 5 villagers, stepped cautiously into the corridor. Marta Greenleaf, practical and unflappable, led, though her hand trembled slightly on the railing. Her husband, Thomas, clutched her arm, trying to appear brave. Young farmhands Cobb and Finn boasted loudly, but their quivering voices betrayed them. And Eliza Thornberry, ever curious, wandered a little too close to the first illusions. Nicholas waited, his massive figure blending with the shadows. As they gathered around the first suit of armor, he moved deliberately, step by step. The metal creaked, echoing through the corridor. When he slammed his hammer onto his shield, the sound rolled like thunder, and the villagers screamed, scrambling toward the next chamber. Laughter rumbled from Nicholas, echoing down the dungeon, mixing with Bink's eerie cackling, and Jerica's sudden appearances. Night of endless screams. As night deepened, groups streamed through the dungeon, each reacting in unique ways. Farmers fortified with ale stumbled, terrified of Jerica's sudden falls from the ceiling. Teenage girls huddled together in delight and fear. Even Bailiff Hendrick, dignified and composed, let out an utterly undignified scream as Nicholas revealed himself. Laughter, shrieks, and whispers of awe filled the dungeon halls. Nicholas felt something unfamiliar, joy, real, deep satisfaction at the terror and delight he had orchestrated. By midnight, the last groups trickled out. Bink tallied the gold, and the chest overflowed. 250 coins gleamed, proof that their work, their creativity, had not only scared but delighted the people of Millhaven. Their exhausted smiles were mirrored by Jerica and Bink, all 3 sitting in the damp dungeon entrance, breathing in the cool night air, reflecting on the success of the night. A new opportunity. Hendrick approached with the village council, praising the haunted house and offering opportunities to create more seasonal events, enchanted snow for winter, magical festivals for spring, summer, and harvest. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bink exchanged glances. Their lives had shifted from adventuring and minor exploits to creators of wonder, terror, and magic for an entire village. A new path had opened, one paved not with combat, but with imagination, collaboration, and spectacle. As they walked back to Millhaven, carting their treasure, stars glimmered overhead. Their hearts were light, their minds already racing with possibilities. Nicholas began to whistle an old marching tune. Jerica added harmony, and Bink conjured small, dancing lights to illuminate the path. Adventurers they remained, but not in the way they had expected, and for the first time that was perfectly fine. The morning after All Hallows' Eve, the village of Millhaven was unusually quiet. The usual bustle of the market, the hammering of the blacksmith, and the laughter of children playing near the fountain seemed muted, as if the entire town were still recovering from the night before. Yet there was an undercurrent of excitement in the air. Whispered conversations drifted from open windows and alleyways. Every villager had a story about the haunted house of Arashai, and every tale grew taller with each telling. Nicholas walked the cobblestone streets, his armor replaced with more mundane travel clothes, but his movements still carried the precision of someone accustomed to wielding a great warhammer. Jerica trailed slightly behind, her horns hidden under a hood, though her sharp gaze missed nothing. Bink skipped ahead, muttering to himself about the next enchantments he would need, and occasionally pausing to conjure tiny, harmless sparks that made the leaves along the path momentarily shimmer. Morning reflections. They met at the Flagon for breakfast, a small wooden tavern warmed by a crackling hearth. Old Mossback Girder was already there, sipping his morning ale with a wide grin. "I've never seen the village talk like that in decades," he said, shaking his head. "People were still trembling when I closed up last night." Trembling, I say, but grinning ear to ear. Nicholas poured himself a mug of hot cider, savoring the warmth as it spread through his chest. "It was fun," he admitted, though the word seemed inadequate. "More than fun. There was satisfaction. Seeing them jump, seeing their faces. Jerica's grin was wicked. Fun for you, maybe. I almost gave the baker's wife a heart attack. You should have seen her stumble back into her husband. Priceless." Bink, still scribbling in a notebook, didn't look up. "You underestimate the subtle artistry of sound and light, Nicholas. I timed the groan enchantments and the flickering torches to peak precisely when they approached your alcove. Every reaction measured, calculated, delightful." Nicholas laughed, the sound low and rich, echoing through the small tavern. "We made them feel fear and wonder. That's not something most adventurers can claim to do." Jerica leaned back in her chair, still smudged from last night's paint. "I'd call it art," she said softly, surprising both Nicholas and Bink. "Sculpting emotion, shaping experience. That's art. And we did it." Village buzz. By mid-morning, the streets filled with chatter. Children reenacted scenes from the dungeon, waving sticks as imaginary weapons, daring each other to pass through invisible corridors of fog and floating swords. Merchants bragged that they had seen the knight move with his own eyes, exaggerating every detail for dramatic effect. The apothecary's daughter, Eliza, was already plotting to return next year, her notebook filled with sketches of illusions she wanted to try. Old Hendrik the bailiff, still pale from his encounter with Nicholas's statue, attempted to maintain his dignity while also explaining to curious villagers how clever the illusions had been. "The lighting," he said, pointing with a shaking hand, "and the timing of the traps, remarkable, if utterly terrifying." Nicholas and Jerica exchanged glances. Even the stoic Hendrik had been impressed. That, they realized, was another kind of victory. Bink, however, remained restless. "This is only the beginning," he muttered, twirling his staff absent-mindedly. "Next time we can expand more illusions, more chambers, more interactive elements. Imagine a dungeon that evolves with every group that enters, learning from their reactions." His eyes gleamed, bright and wild, and Nicholas felt that familiar thrill. Bink's enthusiasm was contagious, pulling everyone into his vision. Planning for winter's splendor. That evening, the three gathered in a quiet room above the Flagon, maps and scrolls spread before them. Winter's splendor would be their next project, a magical festival unlike anything Millhaven had ever seen. Snow indoors, enchanted lights, ice sculptures that moved as villagers approached. Bink's ideas poured out in torrents, each one more elaborate than the last. Jerica, always practical, circled the room, sketching layouts on parchment. "We'll need safe paths," she said, "or someone will break a leg. And traps need to be not too terrifying. Winter fun, not haunted terror." Nicholas nodded. "We'll use fear sparingly. Make it magical, beautiful. The same principles apply: lighting, sound, timing. But it's hope and wonder, not dread, this time. Bink clapped his hands, sparks erupting from his fingertips. Exactly. And prizes. We can enchant the gifts, make them interactive. A snowflake that floats and melts in your hand. A lantern that changes color with your emotions. We'll make winter's splendor unforgettable. Jerica chuckled. You're insane. And brilliant, Nicholas added, smiling. Let's not forget brilliant. Villager participation. Over the next week, the trio began recruiting villagers to help. Some were eager. The apothecary offered his workshop for magical contraptions. Farmers volunteered to create large decorative props, and children were enlisted as junior guides to help demonstrate safe ways to interact with the festival. Even the skeptical ones, like Ruddy Parsons, could not resist the excitement. I'll help, he grumbled, but only because I want to see Nicholas in armor again. That statue of his terrifying. Nicholas merely nodded, knowing that Parsons would be equally thrilled and embarrassed when he witnessed the first rehearsals. Illusions and practice. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bink spent countless hours refining their illusions. Nicholas practiced moving through shadowed corridors, testing how long to delay his movements for maximum effect. Jerica honed her demon persona, adjusting how her cloak fluttered and how her painted face caught the light. Bink experimented with fog, enchanted sparks, floating orbs, and illusions of whispering figures that moved just at the edge of vision. Every day they added more detail. The villagers became both participants and testers, walking through corridors and chambers that were still in construction, reacting to early versions of the scares. The feedback was invaluable. Marta Greenleaf insisted the floating swords needed a warning shimmer too realistic for some. Thomas suggested slightly slower transitions between sound effects. Each adjustment brought the experience closer to perfection. An unexpected visitor. One evening, a stranger arrived at the flagon, a tall figure cloaked in dark fabric, hood shadowing his face. He introduced himself as Lorik, a traveling merchant and illusionist, who had heard of the haunted house of Arasai. He offered advice and rare materials for enchantments, intrigued by the combination of illusion, sound, and fear. I've seen many haunted attractions, Lorik said, eyes glinting from beneath the hood, but never one with such meticulous detail and heart. You do not merely scare them, you guide them through emotion. That is rare. Nicholas listened, humbled. We just wanted to give the village a night they'd remember. Lorik smiled faintly. You have succeeded, and perhaps you underestimate how powerful that is. Memory shapes perception. You've created legend, not just fear. Bink's eyes sparkled. Legend indeed. Imagine winter's splendor. We could make people speak of it for years. Jerica's lips curled in a grin, or tremble in anticipation. Escalating plans. By mid-October, they were well into planning winter's splendor. Nicholas walked through sketches of ice palaces and enchanted forests. Jerica plotted interactive displays, ensuring that each moment was magical yet safe. Bink experimented with enchanted fireworks, magical snow, and floating lanterns. The three of them were a whirlwind of energy and ideas, their excitement infecting anyone who entered the flagon to watch them work. Even the townsfolk began to spread rumors. Children whispered to each other about magical snow that danced in your hands, lanterns that would float alongside you, and glowing figures that might appear as guides or mischievous spirits. Parents worried about the cold and frost, but curiosity was too strong. Millhaven was alive with anticipation, testing the magic. Nicholas and Jerica led the first small test of winter's splendor. A select group of villagers were invited to walk through an early version of the festival. Snow glittered in the torchlight, sparkling and warm against cold fingers. Enchanted lights shifted with movement, making it feel as if the forest itself were alive. Ice sculptures slowly rotated. Tiny fairies trapped within glowing orbs appeared to flutter toward observers, and floating lanterns cast gentle shadows on the ground. Screams were replaced with gasps of awe, laughter replacing fear. Nicholas watched the villagers' faces light up with delight, realizing that joy and wonder could rival terror for impact. Jerica glided past as a dark, shadowy figure, startling a few late-comers, but quickly turning to grin, revealing the fun and fear when paired. Bink's illusions were flawless, orchestrating reactions that were measured, precise, and delightful. The first frost came early that year, dusting the cobblestones of Millhaven with a thin layer of sparkling ice. It didn't deter the villagers. If anything, it enhanced the anticipation. Rumors about the upcoming winter's splendor had spread beyond the town, reaching travelers and neighboring villages. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bink were busier than ever. Every morning they gathered in the flagon, their heads bent over maps, scrolls, and enchantments, their hands stained with ink, paint, and magical residue. The workshop. The flagon had become a hub of creativity. Nicholas's armor had been temporarily set aside, replaced with practical winter attire. Jerica still wore bits of her costume for testing illusions, a tattered cloak and painted horns, but now it was layered over warm clothing. Bink floated between tables, muttering incantations, his eyes flickering with the glow of minor magical experiments. They had enlisted the help of villagers with unique talents. The apothecary provided rare herbs to enhance illusions. The blacksmith forged delicate yet sturdy mounts for enchanted displays, and children were recruited to move props and test the effect of illusions in real time. Nicholas often caught himself marveling at how alive the workshop had become chaotic. Yes, but with a vibrant energy he had never experienced in dungeon expeditions or adventuring. We need to make sure the snow doesn't melt too quickly, Jerica said one morning, examining a small pile of enchanted flakes that glimmered in the torchlight. It needs to last long enough for every group to walk through, but not become icy death traps. Bink tapped the pile, whispering a spell. The snow danced upward, swirled in perfect circles, and then drifted gently back down. Perfect, he declared, eyes alight. We'll enchant the flakes to maintain their form and temperature. A balance of physics and magic. Nicholas laughed. You make it sound like calculus. It is, Bink said solemnly, then added, with flair. Village participation expands. Word of the festival's preparation spread quickly. Villagers offered to contribute in ways Nicholas had not imagined. The bakery agreed to enchant confections so that they would change flavor in mid-bite. Farmers donated frozen ponds to serve as skating rinks, enhanced with gentle illusions to make the ice sparkle unnaturally. Craftsmen fashioned enchanted sleighs that moved without horses, and musicians rehearsed magical instruments that could produce multiple harmonies at once, playing with the air itself. Even Bailiff Hendrik became unexpectedly invested. Though still cautious, he helped approve safety measures, adjust lighting for optimal effect, and offered ideas for crowd management. The cautious bureaucrat had somehow transformed into an enthusiastic co-conspirator, drawn in by the magic of the three adventurers' vision. Magical complications. As the festival drew closer, challenges began to arise. Not every enchantment worked perfectly on the first try. Snowflakes occasionally froze too solidly, threatening to crack delicate ice sculptures. Floating lanterns collided mid-air, spinning chaotically before dropping. Bink muttered long strings of counterspells, gesturing wildly with his staff, while Jerica recalibrated the magical timings. Nicholas, meanwhile, focused on choreography, ensuring that every illusion, movement, and reaction would flow naturally. He tested paths through the forest and the village square, timing when lanterns would flicker, snow would swirl, and magical creatures would appear. He discovered that a tiny misalignment could shatter the intended effect. One misstep and the illusion of a snow sprite might resemble a floating rag instead. "Perfection is harder than slaying goblins," he muttered one evening, scrubbing a smear of enchanted frost from his glove. Jericho laughed, and far less bloody. Bink's grin was wild, but infinitely more satisfying. The first preview. 2 nights before the festival, they invited a select group of villagers for a preview. Families, curious teenagers, and even Hendrik joined, wandering through the partially completed magical landscape. Snow drifted in gentle swirls, lanterns floated in choreographed patterns, and ice sculptures began to rotate, reflecting candlelight in sparkling patterns. Children shrieked with delight at the tiny snow sprites chasing them through the forest. Parents gasped at illusions of glowing deer weaving through trees in impossible patterns. Nicholas watched from the shadows, timing his movements, testing reactions. He was reminded of the haunted dungeon, not with fear this time, but with awe. Jerica glided past, her horns glittering under the lantern light. She startled a few participants, then laughed as they recovered, showing her control over the balance of fear and excitement. Bink's illusions dazzled floating snowflakes that glimmered with inner light, magical orbs that whispered faint riddles, even subtle sounds of distant bells synchronized with the villagers' movements. By the end, the visitors left with wide eyes, chattering endlessly about what they had seen. Some swore the forest itself had come alive. Others argued over the placement of snow sprites or the exact timing of lantern flickers. Nicholas felt the same thrill he had felt during the haunted house, but now it was paired with pride and wonder rather than mischief and fear. Festival Eve. The night before winter's splendor, the adventurers worked tirelessly. Paths were laid with magical lighting, snow flurries timed to swirl along walkways, and enchanted creatures positioned to respond to villagers' movements. Jerica tested every illusion, ensuring they looked natural while still producing awe. Bink hovered between stations, fine-tuning every enchantment and improvising solutions to last-minute problems. Nicholas coordinated timing, making sure the festival's flow would maintain a sense of continuous magic. Outside, a gentle snow began to fall naturally, merging with the enchanted flakes to create a scene of perfect winter wonder. The village square glimmered with possibilities, ice sculptures shaped like mythical beasts, lanterns suspended in midair, and magical snow that seemed to sparkle with a life of its own. "Tomorrow," Nicholas said, surveying the square, "all of this comes alive." Jerica's smile was sharp, satisfied, but tired. "We'll see if the villagers survive the wonder." Bink's grin was wild. "They won't just survive. They'll remember it forever." Part 3, Closing Thoughts. Nicholas wandered through the quiet festival grounds, alone for a moment, marveling at the potential of what they had built. The snow swirled gently around his boots. Lanterns reflected in the ice with a magical shimmer, and distant trees glittered with frost. He realized something profound. The thrill of adventure didn't only lie in battles or heroic deeds. It could be found in crafting experiences that touched hearts, inspired imaginations, and brought people together. Jerica joined him silently, her reflection shimmering in the ice. "Are you ready?" she asked. Nicholas nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Ready to make magic." Bink appeared with a flourish of sparks, twirling his staff. Then let the winter's splendor begin. And somewhere, high above the village, the stars glimmered as if winking at their new adventure, promising that Millhaven would never be quite the same again. The morning of winter's splendor dawned crisp and clear. Frost clung to rooftops and cobblestones, glittering under the pale winter sun. Villagers emerged from their homes, bundled tightly in furs and scarves, eyes wide with excitement. Rumors of the festival's magical spectacles had traveled fast, and many had arrived hours early. Children pressed their noses to frosted windows, eagerly waiting for the doors to open. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bink were already at the village square before sunrise, performing last-minute checks. Lanterns floated into position, shimmering snowflakes danced along invisible currents, and the enchanted ice sculptures spun gently, catching the light at perfect angles. Every corner of the village square seemed imbued with magic. "Are the snowflakes stable?" Jerica asked, examining the gently swirling flakes. "Stable enough to make a few small children scream in delight," Bink replied, eyes gleaming as he tested a floating orb that whispered riddles when touched. "And that, my dear Jerica, is the measure of success?" Nicholas checked the placement of enchanted creatures, a fox that glimmered with frost, deer whose antlers sparkled with tiny lights, and small sprites that zipped between the ice sculptures. Each was timed to appear as visitors approached, creating the illusion that the village itself was alive. The festival begins. By mid-morning, the first visitors arrived. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bink greeted them at the entrance, distributing magical lanterns that reacted to movement, guiding each group along the intended path. The villagers gasped as enchanted snowflakes danced across the streets, landing on heads and hands without melting, while soft chimes followed their every step. Children ran ahead, laughing as frost sprites darted in front of them, leaving trails of sparkling snow. Parents followed cautiously, marveling at illusions that made the village square appear impossibly large, with twisting ice towers and glowing paths. Nicholas's careful choreography ensured that every group experienced the festival differently, even though the layout remained the same. Jerica appeared at various points along the path, her horns glinting in the sunlight. With a flick of her wrist, she caused snow to swirl in circular patterns, creating vortexes that drew gasps of awe from children. She whispered subtle illusions into their ears, giving each visitor a private experience of magic. Bink wandered among the crowd, muttering spells and causing objects to float, shimmer, and change shape. He made small fireworks blossom in the air, enchanted animals leap gracefully, and glowing orbs trace patterns in the snow. Children pointed, laughed, and squealed in delight. Adults, though attempting to appear dignified, could not hide the wonder in their eyes. Unexpected mishaps. Not everything went perfectly. At one point, an enchanted sleigh designed to glide gently across the square began to move faster than intended, sending a group of teenagers squealing as it zipped by. Nicholas sprang into action, using a subtle counterspell to slow it down before anyone was hurt. A small cluster of ice sculptures, enchanted to rotate and tell stories, collided when a gust of wind interfered with their timing. Bink muttered under his breath, recalibrating the enchantments while Jerica distracted the crowd with a sudden swirl of sparkling snow. Nicholas caught a glimpse of the village children, still laughing despite the near mishap, and realized that part of the festival's charm was its unpredictability. The heart of the festival. At the center of the square, a large ice stage had been set up. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bink orchestrated performances throughout the day, magical storytelling, illusions of flying creatures, and choreographed displays of light and snow. Villagers watched in awe, some gasping, others clapping, and children squealing with excitement. Nicholas found himself directing traffic, adjusting enchantments, and occasionally stepping in to enhance an illusion with the power of his armor. Jerica glided through the crowd, her face painted, cloak fluttering, delighting visitors with spontaneous magical displays. Bink acted as master of ceremonies, conjuring magical effects on demand and improvising illusions to keep the festival lively and unpredictable. By midday, the square was crowded. Vendors sold enchanted treats that changed flavor mid-bite, magical drinks that shimmered with colored lights, and small trinkets that moved on their own. Villagers wandered through the displays, occasionally stopping to marvel at snow sprites, enchanted lanterns, or ice sculptures that told stories as visitors passed. A magical parade? The highlight of winter's splendor was the parade of enchanted creatures. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bink had coordinated dozens of illusions, from frosted deer with glowing antlers to winged snow creatures that soared above the village square. Children ran alongside, laughing and trying to touch the illusions, which playfully evaded them without harm. The parade culminated in a grand display of lights and snow. Bink orchestrated an array of floating lanterns that spiraled into the sky, forming constellations that mirrored those above. Nicholas raised his gaunted hand, creating a subtle shockwave that made snowflakes shimmer and dance in perfect synchronization. Jerica's illusions added depth, making it appear as if the village square had transformed into a magical winter wonderland, alive with movement and light. Evening reflections. As night fell, the crowd thinned. Families lingered, reluctant to leave, while the adventurers began dismantling minor illusions and resetting enchantments for the next day. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bink huddled together, exhausted but exhilarated. "We did it," Nicholas said quietly, surveying the twinkling lights, the swirling snow, and the happy faces of the departing villagers. "We actually did it." Jerica leaned against him, smiling. And no rats, no goblins, no ancient curses. Just pure magic. Bink floated lazily, sparks trailing from his staff. And people are already talking about next year. Nicholas laughed. It's more than a festival. It's life. The promise of more. The villagers returned home, their hearts full of wonder and stories to tell. Word of winter's splendor spread quickly, drawing visitors from neighboring towns who wished to witness the enchantments for themselves. Nicholas, Jerica, and Bink realized that they had found a new calling, not slaying monsters, not hunting treasure, but creating experiences that inspired awe, brought people together, and left lasting memories. Standing in the quiet village square, Nicholas watched the final snowflake drift to the ground. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, the same thrill he had felt during the haunted house, magnified by the knowledge that their magic had touched so many lives. Jerica's voice broke the silence. So, what's next? Nicholas grinned, eyes shining. Whatever we want. Whatever we dream. We've got a year to plan the next adventure. Bink twirled his staff, sparks flying into the night. And the world is our canvas. The stars overhead seemed to twinkle in agreement, a silent promise that Millhaven would never be quite the same, and that magic, joy, and wonder would always find a place in the hearts of those who dared to imagine.